So I basically have been working on behavioural ecology of fishes, well, for too long, essentially. I spend a lot of time watching fish. That really is my fundamental passion. But I also come from a long line of fishermen, believe it or not. So my family have been fly fishing, and I started fly fishing from basically the moment I could hold a rod. I'm much more likely to jump in with my mask and snorkel now. But basically I'm going to try and give an overview of my work and my colleagues' work looking at cognition in fishes, largely because certainly when I started doing this 20 years ago, fish were more or less thought of as automatons. Completely inflexible behaviour, everything they did was pre-programmed, and nobody paid much attention to them in any respect, let alone in a welfare context. Why was I interested in fishes? Well, I had my personal interest because I spent a lot of time snorkeling in various places in Southeast Asia, so I had my head underwater a lot, and that is really what inspired me. But now I have plenty of excuses. Fishes interact with humans and humans with fishes in many more ways than you might expect. We've already talked about commercial fishing and live catch. That is a huge proportion of the protein that people rely on, and increasingly so. Aquaculture is one of the fastest growing industries in the world, and especially in Southeast Asia. Fish as pets, you may not think about this, but after cats and dogs, more people have pets fish than anything else. Numerically, there are more pet fish than there are any other animal. And of course, we use them in science for scientific research. Now, in science, fish are treated just the same as any other vertebrate. So if I was to poke a fish in some way, it would be no different from poking any other animal. So scientists are already operating under pretty strict rules and regulations with respect to fish welfare and ethics. Why else would we work on fishes? Well, this slide pretty much says it all. The vast majority of vertebrate species on the planet are fish. So frankly, if you want to work on understanding the evolution of animals, you should really be working on fishes. But if you go to any conference on animal behaviour, behavioural ecology, evolutionary biology, a very small fraction of the talks will have anything to do with fish at all. The other reason for having that slide up there alludes to what the previous speaker was talking about. There are currently over 32,000 species of fish that are described, and many, many times more that are undescribed. So you certainly cannot get up and start talking about fish. And I'm just talking about bony fish. I'm not talking about skates and rays, which is a wholly different kettle of fish, so to speak. So what are we talking about? 32.5, probably up to 60,000 different species. So there are an awful lot of fish on the planet. Despite the fact that we interact with them almost on a daily basis, most people do not think about them at all beyond eating them or perhaps watching Goldie swim around their plate. Of course, the recreational fishing lobby is huge in Australia, so heaps of people actually go out and actively catch fish as a pastime. There's a massive industry involved with that. And as I mentioned, plenty of people are working in aquaculture and fisheries. But most people's expectation of fish cognition is this, basically. Dory is one of my favourite characters of all time from one of my all-time favourite movies, more so now that I have kids, 3 of them, and they know it in 2 languages, which is awesome. But Dory suffers from short-term memory loss, and it's obvious even to my 2-year-old son that that is hilarious. There is no way Dory can survive in the real world if she doesn't have a decent memory. She doesn't know who she is, where she's going, what's going on. She would be shark bait like that in the real world, okay? So the reality is fish are much smarter than people give them credit for. The standard thing people think is that fish have a 2-second memory. Who's heard of that, 2-second memory? Standard issue. Every country you go to, it varies slightly from 2 to 10 seconds. Either way, people have a very low opinion. So fish are in a bad need of a serious PR boost. And that's kind of what I do on the side when I'm not doing science. So one of the things that interests me in particular and why I give a lot of talks on this topic is because there's a massive gap between people's expectation and the public opinion of fish cognition and behaviour and scientific reality. So I spent a good half of my life studying fish cognition. Hopefully some of you will have seen this paper that came out just last week, which is just a kind of tongue-in-cheek review of how smart fishes are. It came out in Nature, has some very nice videos associated with it. It's very flashy. I think I might hire Alison as the PR person because she's done a very nice job. Far better than I've managed in the 20 years that I've been talking about fish cognition. So there's a massive literature on fish cognition now, and it is growing every day. I could show you a lovely graph which shows you an exponential increase in the number of papers that are addressing fish behaviour and cognition in particular. In fact, you can read the book and you'll see one of those graphs. It's not very up to date, but a couple of years old. Well, why else do I work on fish? I just happen to teach vertebrate evolution as well. And one of the things that's startling is that people seem to think that fish are stupid or perhaps primitive in some way because they've been on the planet for a long time. Well, that's true. They have been on the planet for about 500 million years. It's an awfully long time. But it's not like they've been sitting in some sort of evolutionary backwater in that time. They have been evolving in just the same way as every other branch of the evolutionary tree has. If you go out into the world today, the vast majority of the species you see actually evolved around the same time as we did. So they're no more primitive than us, all right? So it's not like they've been sitting there doing nothing. I would say they had 150 million years head start on us. They got it right. They know what they're doing. The interesting thing is, and this is something that I tell all of my undergraduate students, is that humans are just fish with a few tweaks. So most stuff that makes you go, you got from a fishy ancestor. So there's really no scientific reason to think that they should be different to the rest of us. So that's a sort of brief introduction to why I got into this in the first place, perhaps why it might be interesting. The other thing that I usually do in a whirlwind tour every couple of months, I talk to a bunch of students about this kind of topic, and I try to convince people that fish are way underjudged in the world of cognition. These are just a couple of things that people generally tend to relate to because they look at those things, they think, oh, they're all the sorts of things that smart animals can do, intelligent animals can do. It wasn't so long ago that we thought that list was unique to us. And increasingly, that is not the case. So if you look through that list, you start to think, oh, actually there's some pretty interesting things going on there, and perhaps some of them might blow your mind a little bit, particularly that whole Machiavellian intelligence business. Start with classical conditioning. Okay, classical conditioning is basically a fundamental way that nearly all animals learn. It's a really simple learning process. Action A happens, it predicts action B, and animals learn that. It's the way that you can get by in the environment. Everyone would have heard of Pavlov's dogs. There's lots of nodding. Yes, Pavlov's dogs, good. So Pavlovian or classical conditioning is basically a very simple form of learning. You can do this in an undergraduate class. Fishes can learn this very quickly. One of the first things I did as a postgraduate is this. Make a flashy light go, sometime later some food arrives. How quickly do the fish learn that? It's exactly what Pavlov did with the dogs. The dogs take a couple of trials. Fishes, where you can see some various learning curves here depending where they're from, you'll notice that the captive reared ones are hopeless, relatively so, but they're still doing it in 14 trials. The wild ones are doing it in 6 or 7 trials, which is faster than a rat, not as fast as a dog, but they're fast. What about time-place learning? It's a little bit more tricky because you not only have to learn something, but you have to learn that it's happening at a certain time of day and it's happening at a particular location. So there's lots of bits of information that you have to learn there. You've got the conditioning happening first, but in this time it's a certain time at a certain place. Cichlid fishes can do one time, one place in 3 trials. That's fast. This is a couple of Persilids. These ones are from Panama. I was bumming around in the bottom of a dilapidated school, running these guys through their paces. These guys can learn 2 places at 2 times in 13 or 14 trials. That's really fast, faster than rats. And the only thing that beats them so far is some work on birds, which at the moment they've done 4 places at 4 times. Nobody's ever tried that in fishes. Nevertheless, it shows that they're well and truly on track. So spatial learning, I think, has been done to death in fishes, and for a long time we used to think that spatial learning was really cool. There's some fantastic work on corvids showing awesome spatial learning and looking at the underlying brain structures. You can do exactly the same work in fishes and get exactly the same result. Instead of looking at the hippocampus, you're looking at the telencephalon. It's a different name for the same part of the brain. It's doing the same thing in very disparate animals, but it's effectively the same thing. This is one of my favourite things. It's from an early paper in the 50s. My students have replicated this. Basically, if you get these intertidal gobies, if you go into any intertidal rock pool around Sydney Harbour, you'll find it loaded with gobies. There's about half a dozen different species. Won't surprise you that we know nothing about any of them. But if you take them and you teach them a bunch of spatial learning tasks, they learn it really quickly. This is a 50s example where this guy actually built an artificial rock platform in his garden. I guess he had more time than I do. And what these things do is they have home pool. At high tide, they go out and they explore across the rock platform, and at low tide, they go back into their home pool. If you tag them and displace them, they come back to the same pool time and time again. Even if you displace them 30 or 40 metres away, they come back. They know their pool extremely well. But more to the point, they know, they have a map in their heads about what the surrounding places look like and where they are in space. That's called a cognitive map. So if you go in there with a whopping great stick at low tide, scare the bejeebers out of them, they leap blindly into a neighbouring pool. They know exactly where it is, and it's not an accident. And they can do that over and over again, skip, 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 until they get into the open ocean. That map is stored in their minds. That sort of stuff has been illustrated in birds and rats, but not much else. So they can clearly learn stuff, and you might well ask, well, how long do they remember things for? And there's a huge amount of literature that shows that learning and memory in all animals, including fishes, is under very strong selective pressure from natural selection. And in fishes, learning to avoid dangerous things seems to keep them motivated for a very long time. They remember that sort of stuff for a very long time. Hook shyness in fishes, for example, single stimulus, they can remember that for years and show avoidance behaviour subsequently. This is the first experiment I did as a research student, so it's going back a way. Here I just exposed these rainbow fish again because I'm in Queensland and they're everywhere. I can go down and get a net and catch them and put them in a fish tank. Exposed them to a trawl net. It's an artificial net. I was teaching a course in fish and fisheries at the time. The trawl net goes down the tank. There's a little escape route, which you might use, say, for bycatch or something, net avoidance in a commercial setting. The fish just have to learn where that escape route is. It's a spatial learning thing. It's pretty dynamic. The fish just swim around. They get squished against the end of the tank, not very much, but enough to annoy them if they don't find that escape route. So there's some negative reinforcement going on. But after the first trial, they've pretty much sorted it out. Second trial, they know where that hole is. And by the fourth trial, they're swimming along in front of that escape route. And then as soon as they see the end of the tank, they just turn and go straight through that escape route. Put those fish away on the shelf effectively for a year. You test them a year later. You can see what that happens here. You can see that red line across there. That's a year later. They continue on as if I'd been testing them immediately after. So if I'd done 10 trials in a row, that's the sort of thing that we'd be looking at it. So it's not only do they remember it for a year, but they carry on as if nothing had happened, which is astonishing. These fish live maybe 1 or 2 years in the wild. So it's effectively 5-10 minutes of training. They remember it for the rest of their life. And there's stuff that I've forgotten yesterday. So I'm pretty sure they have a pretty good memory. How about living in social groups? One of the things that people often talk about when we're talking about the evolution of cognition in humans, why are we so smart? Well, hopefully you would have heard of the social intelligence hypothesis. We've got all these weird social networks things going on. People are gossiping about us and trying to stab us in the back and all those kind of things. You need to keep track of who's who, who's doing what in social circumstances. For a long time, that was used as the paradigm for explaining why humans are as smart as we do. Why do we have such a big brain? Then a bunch of very smart people from Scotland, University of St Andrews, got together and they said, you know what, primate social groups are pretty complicated. And they used this Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis to explain complicated social relationships in chimps and apes, and use that to explain why chimps and apes have such big brains. Turns out heaps of animals have complex social interactions, and fish, of course, are extremely well known for being in schools. Who would have thought? When you look at a group of fish, if you collect a bunch of fish, a school of fish in the wild, it's not a random selection of individuals. They are actively choosing who to hang out with and who not to hang out with, who to avoid, who to watch out for. If you give a choice, guppies, for example, you could choose any fish as long as it's remotely social. If you give them a choice, on one side of the tank, there's a bunch of familiar fish that they've seen before. On the other side, there's a bunch of strangers. 9 times out of 10, they are going to go for the bunch of familiar individuals. It's like me, if I go to a party, I'm not much of an extrovert. I'm not bad, but, you know, if I see friends on one side and strangers on the other, I am going to go friends every time. Fish are doing the same thing for the same reasons. Why would you do that? Because in certain contexts, you can predict the way familiar individuals are going to behave. And we already shown that in both foraging and predator avoidance, being in a school of familiar individuals gives you heaps of advantage over being in a bunch of strangers. Think of an all-star soccer team. The all-stars, they're awesome by themselves. Put them together against a team that's well-drilled, that know what everybody's role is. The well-drilled team will beat the all-stars hand down every time because everybody knows their role and they do the right thing in the right context. What are some of the things you might want to do? Why? Why would you want to know who's who? Well, you don't want to pick a fight with a head honcho. That's a really good reason to know who's who. Fish can actually tell their position in a hierarchy from a third-party position. They don't even have to interact with the other individuals. They can see two fishes fighting and they can say, oh, that guy's pretty tough, that guy's not so tough, and I reckon I can beat him, but I can't beat him. They can do that. They also change their behaviour depending on who's watching. So they're aware of what other fishes are thinking about them. So if two males are fighting and they know a female is watching, they reduce the aggression and they beef up the display. And the opposite is true if a male is watching. They beef up the aggression and they reduce the display. And a paper came out just a few weeks ago showing that females are doing the same thing. They have the same awareness of what's going on and they change their behaviour in accordance. So cooperation and reconciliation are two of the big things that people think about in terms of Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis. And Machiavelli, hopefully you know, went that close to being burnt by the church for giving away their secrets. He basically wrote a treatise called The Prince, which said, you do X, Y, and Z, manipulate the masses to get ahead. That very nearly got him killed. I mean, that is standard issue for politicians these days. They wouldn't even blink an eyelid. So reconciliation and cooperation, these are two things that Machiavelli really concentrated on, and certainly some of the hallmarks of social intelligence. Hopefully some of you would have heard the press releases that were associated with this work. This is Redouane Boucheri. He's actually from Switzerland, but he does a lot of work on the Great Barrier Reef out here at Lizard Island primarily. So he was snorkeling around Lizard Island and he saw these nice big gropers here going up to moray eels. This is the moray eel here. The groper went up, shook its head, did some weird display, and instead of fighting each other, as one might expect, the moray eel actually came out of its little hole and they started cooperating in a hunting context. So normally what moray eels do is they move amongst the coral rubble. Okay, they can attack all the fishes in the little hidey hole places, but once the fishes get out of that rubble into the open ocean, the moray's game is over. You cannot get those fish. The opposite is true for the groper. Its typical behaviour is to cruise over the top of the rubble. If anything dives into the rubble, it's gone as far as that fish is concerned. If you put the two together, there's nowhere for the prey to go. And these guys know it. So they actually selectively choose, it's not a random selection of the cooperation, they selectively pick an individual to cooperate with and they move out across the reef together and they're constantly talking to one another, visually, possibly chemically, maybe even through audio, we don't know, and they actually cooperate with one another to maximise their prey success. Reconciliation, another one. Probably, I'm not going to talk about much of my work, but again, this is a good example from Redouane Boucheri. He's been working on social reconciliation in these contexts for a very long time. He studies cleaner fish. I don't know if any of you have had the privilege of being cleaned by a cleaner fish, but I have. They have a remarkable ability to recognise scrapes and scratches and scabs on just about anything, even a human. So these guys, what they do is they have a feeding station, and if a client comes along, it puts open this clean me display, which basically flares its gills, opens its mouth, flares its fins, and this little dude comes off his bommy and he starts picking off dead and decaying things on the skin, in the teeth, any parasites it might come across. Now, occasionally, they accidentally nip one of their clients, and that's not a good thing to do because the client can swim away and potentially visit another cleaning station just down the road. So these guys have to maintain a squeaky clean record. If they do that, these guys actually chase after the client and give them a back rub. Nobody knew why. At the time, it was like, what is going on? But when you bring a coral reef fish into the lab and you offer it a rotating brush, they actually like to have their back rubbed. You measure their cortisol response, who knew it, but it's therapeutic, it reduces stress responses. And if you want to measure stress in fishes, you use exactly the same kit as you would for a human, same hormones, same everything. I buy them off the shelf from the medical people. Same test. So, How about social learning? Social learning is a nice one because it's an interesting way of passing information from one individual to another. It's bypassing individual learning. It's much more efficient, but it also means information can move from generation to generation. It can not only just move within a generation, it can move across generations. Now, I always like practical stuff, so when I moved to Cambridge, I started working on hatchery-reared salmonids. This is Atlantic salmon juveniles. When you rear Atlantic salmon under very controlled industrial conditions, they have no access to predators, no access to live prey. They're kept in ridiculous densities like you would not believe. And they have no clue about the world in general. They're completely institutionalized in every sense of the word. You give these guys a live prey item to attack and they actually back away into the corner out of fear. But you can teach them. You can teach them if you repeatedly expose them to live prey, and that's what this guy along the bottom here, this guy has already been trained to attack a worm when it comes into the tank. And this pink line that you see here, this is a naive individual who is on the other side of a clear perspex partition. All they do is get to see that experienced guy on the other side foraging on this live food, and lo and behold, by 6 exposures, they've totally figured out how to do that. They're no different from a wild, very experienced fish. Just out of interest, this red line here shows you roughly what an individual would be doing if it was trained by itself. It takes about 16 or so trials to pick that up just on their own through individual learning. The green line is a little bit more interesting. This is actually what happens when you put 2 naive individuals together. The green line, there's actually negative social reinforcement going on there. So one fish is saying like, there's no way I'm getting that worm. And the other fish is saying like, well, if you're not getting it, there's no way I'm going out there. And so they have negative reinforcement. It's another example of social learning, but in a negative context. So what happens if you take this into the field? Well, you can teach fish all sorts of random stuff in the lab. It's very easy. Finding examples in the field, actually it's much more difficult, and proving that it's actually happening is even more difficult. But some people have the luxury of moving entire populations of fishes. My ethics committee would never let me do that, despite that I've been sitting on it for 10 years. I have some sway, but not that much. So in this case, the French grunts, what do? Well, they have these daytime hidey holes where they hide away, and they move out of those hidey holes and move to foraging grounds during the night. They're primarily nocturnal. The path that they use to go from their hidey holes to their foraging grounds is completely controlled by social learning. They completely rely on following knowledgeable individuals. Turns out that this is also true of breeding grounds in cods and all sorts of commercially important species. These guys, what do if you transport a whole population from their home ground to some other place during the day and release them? Well, there's a couple of things that can happen. In this experiment, they left some of the resident fish in this new location. And what happened? All those that were transplanted, they followed the residents and they went to the feeding ground. If you remove the residents, they carry on off in the same direction as if they were at home. They have no clue. Obviously, they don't find the foraging ground because they're not at home. So this is a very nice example of social learning generating cultural traditions. Most of the cultural transmission stuff has occurred in chimps. You might have heard of the various different tools that different populations of chimps use. There's some very nice examples of birdsong that are transported from generation to generation. And you get these sort of quirky population-specific behaviours popping up from place to place. Same is true in fishes. House building, building nests, you might think, oh, that's kind of boring from a cognitive perspective, but there are a few people who think that this gross manipulation of the environment, sometimes in complex ways, is an intermediary road to tool use. And tool use, most of you will be thinking, oh, well, that was a pretty significant point in the evolutionary history of humans. And maybe. Turns out that it's also true of plenty of primates and plenty of birds, and as it turns out, fishes as well. Fishes have been shown to use tools in all sorts of ways. Perhaps the most famous is the archerfish that actually manipulates water and squirts water through the air-water surface interface to hit terrestrial organisms and bring them down to the surface where it can then munch on them. This is a paper that we wrote a couple of years ago. A friend of mine was diving on the barrier reef and heard this weird whack, whack, whack noise. He just had enough air and enough power in his camera to go down and take these series of shots. And there was this awesome wrasse, had these humongous bivalves in its fairly formidable jaws, I might add, and he was smashing it from side to side on 2 anvils that were uniquely positioned so that when he pushed his head from side to side, he didn't have to twist too much and the shell would smash on each of these anvils. The anvils are not only perfectly positioned, but they're also pointy. And it turns out that if you follow these guys around enough, they actually have multiple feeding stations at various points in their territory. Within 2 weeks of us publishing this, some guys in California found a sister species, same family, but they got video, which trumped me. I didn't have video because this guy didn't have enough air, but doing exactly the same thing. The thing is, we don't know how many species are out there doing this right now. We haven't the faintest idea. All right, so fish are pretty smart. I think you'd have to confess that they're pretty smart. Do they feel pain? That's ultimately where we're going with this. And I think you probably guessed from my introduction, given that my, I guess, concentration on evolution, particularly in vertebrates, the reason you and I feel pain in the way that we do is because our fishy ancestors do. If you were to look at the nerves that are responding, they're exactly the same in fishes as they are in humans, exactly the same. There have been those who have argued that what goes on emotionally, the emotional response to pain, is in some way separated from the physical detection of painful stimuli and noxious stimuli. That doesn't make any sense from an evolutionary perspective. The reason you feel pain is so that you can respond to it in a meaningful way. It's to avoid danger in future circumstances. If you don't show that cognitive involvement in pain perception, you don't learn anything and you don't stay away from noxious stimuli in the future. You cannot separate these two things from each other. Some people say, well, fishes don't have the same brain as other vertebrates and therefore can't feel pain in the same way that we do. That comes from a misunderstanding of how humans feel pain, but it also comes from a misunderstanding of how the fish brain works. And it's only really recently that we've understood how the fish brain works. Yes, there are developmental differences in how the brain's developed during ontogeny, but ultimately all the same bits are there. They're in slightly different places, but all the work that's been done most recently show that all the parts of the brain in fishes are doing effectively the same parts that you see in other animals. So what is the evidence for pain perception in fishes? You cannot stick a fish in an MRI machine, or you can, but it's pretty nasty because you tend to blow the thing up. Nobody's let me do that yet. You cannot sit down and ask them a questionnaire from 1 to 10, how much did that hurt? And you know what? If you asked to do that, you cannot take that to a court of law, even in humans. There is huge controversy over quantifying pain perception in humans. It hasn't reached any conclusion in humans, and I dare say it won't do in animals for quite some time. You cannot ask them, but you can watch their behaviour and you can measure physiology. So what do? You poke a fish, you hurt it. First thing that happens, it changes its behaviour. It starts doing unusual things. Same thing as what a human would do. If you've got a sore foot, you limp. Fish do the same thing. You apply pain relief, such as morphine, behaviour turns to normal. Same thing would happen to a human. What happens if you put a fish in a context where they think they're going to be exposed to some sort of painful stimuli? And the answer is, well, they avoid them if they possibly can. They remember that this particular context, place, object was associated with pain in the past. You can measure their stress responses. They get stressed if you put them in those contexts. Exactly the same hormones that we are expressing. The expression is pretty much the same. So they're anticipating pain, stress increases, their behaviour is changing, and I dare say that there would be very little else that you would need to say humans do pretty much the same thing. If you could not fill out that questionnaire, what would you look for? Well, those would be the boxes. I don't really think about the implications too much because frankly, it's not really my interest. My interest is in fish cognition. But the question I would pose is this: would that, given what I've just said, be the ethical treatment of animals? I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I just want people to think about it. The same if you go recreational fishing. Recreational fishing is no different to hunting any other animal. You just have to think about it and accept it. If that's your position, then you're willing to take the risks or whatever, weigh up the pluses and minuses, but at least make an informed decision. All right, that's me. Thanks.